A perfectly set dinner table in a lavish mansion. The clinking of silver, the murmur of polite conversation. This was Victoria Sterling's life, a gilded cage she had learned to call home. But tonight, an uninvited guest shatters the illusion. Her husband's mistress, brazen and cruel, decides this family dinner is the perfect stage to humiliate Victoria and claim her prize. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the matriarch Margaret Sterling to fix the mess. But what she did next wasn't fixing. It was a demolition. No one, least of all her own son, saw the fury she was about to unleash. The dining room of the Sterling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, was a masterpiece of controlled opulence. A heavy crystal chandelier, a relic from a Venetian palace, dripped light onto a mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine. Each place setting was a fortress of silverware, with porcelain plates bearing the family crest, a stoic lion holding a single perfect rose. For 15 years, Victoria Sterling had been the master of this domain, the curator of its perfection. She ensured every fork was aligned, every flower in the centerpiece was fresh, and every guest felt the weight of Sterling tradition, even if they couldn't articulate it. Tonight was the first Sunday of the month, a non-negotiable family dinner. Victoria smoothed the lap of her silk navy dress, a nervous habit she'd never quite managed to break. Across from her, her father-in-law Robert, a man whose presence had faded in direct proportion to his wife's increasing dominance, quietly swirled the burgundy in his glass. Beside him sat Margaret the matriarch, dressed in a severe but exquisitely tailored charcoal suit, her silver hair coiled into a flawless chignon. Margaret Sterling surveyed the room, not as a hostess, but as a queen surveying her court. Her eyes, the colour of a winter sky, missed nothing. Richard's sister Catherine and her husband David filled the remaining seats. They were kind, predictable people who provided a necessary buffer of pleasant, unchallenging conversation. They spoke of their children's recent sailing competition and a planned trip to Aspen. Victoria smiled and nodded, offering the appropriate responses, but her mind was elsewhere. It was on the empty chair beside her. Richard's chair. He was late. Again. It had started subtly, this distance between them. A late night at the office became 2, then a week's worth. Business trips extended without notice. When he was home, he was a ghost. His attention glued to the blue light of his phone. His answers to her questions, monosyllabic and vague. He'd lost weight, started dressing with a younger, sharper edge, and wore a cologne she didn't recognize, a scent that smelled of ambition, and something else she couldn't name, something sharp and foreign. Victoria had tried to talk to him, to breach the silent, growing chasm between them. She'd suggested a vacation, just the two of them, to the Italian coast where they had honeymooned. "I'm swamped, Tory," he'd said, not looking up from his laptop. "The fourth quarter is brutal. You know that." She did know that. For 15 years she had managed their home, raised their 2 now college-aged sons, and chaired charity galas, all to create a perfect, frictionless world for Richard to come home to after his brutal days. She had been the silent partner, the unelected official in charge of the Sterling family's domestic and social grace. It was a job she had performed with diligence and pride. But lately she felt less like a partner and more like a piece of the elegant furniture, something to be admired for its quality, but ultimately taken for granted. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She caught Margaret's gaze from across the table. Her mother-in-law's expression was unreadable, a carefully blank mask. Margaret had never been a warm woman, but she was a stickler for propriety and order. Richard's tardiness, she knew, would be noted as a disruption to that order. In Margaret's world, disruptions were a sign of weakness, of a loss of control. "I'm sure the traffic from the city is dreadful," Catherine offered, her voice a little too bright, sensing the tension. Richard should have left earlier, Margaret stated simply. It wasn't a criticism so much as a declaration of fact, as undeniable as gravity. Dinner is at 7. It has been at 7 for 30 years. Victoria offered a weak smile. He had a last-minute meeting he couldn't get out of. Something about the Hong Kong merger. It was a lie, or at least a guess. He hadn't told her his schedule. She had gleaned it from a half-heard phone call he'd taken while walking out the door that morning. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She hated it, this new role of his apologist. She was defending a man who was no longer there, covering for a husband who had become a stranger. She looked around the table at the familiar faces, the gleaming silver, the portraits of sterling ancestors staring down from the walls, and felt a profound and terrifying sense of isolation. This entire room, this entire life, was built around her marriage to Richard. If that foundation crumbled, what would be left of her? She was Victoria Sterling, wife of Richard, mother of his son's daughter-in-law to Margaret. Without him, or who was she? The thought was a cold dread that seeped into her bones, more chilling than the autumn air outside. Just then, the distant sound of the heavy front door opening echoed through the hall, followed by the murmur of voices. Not just Richard's voice, but a woman's, as well punctuated by a light, tinkling laugh that sounded utterly alien in the hallowed, quiet halls of the Sterling home. Victoria's heart began to hammer against her ribs. Every muscle in her body went rigid. Catherine and David paused their conversation, their forks hovering mid-air. Robert looked up from his wine, a flicker of curiosity in his tired eyes. Only Margaret remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the arched doorway to the dining room. She didn't look surprised. She looked like a predator that had just heard a twig snap in the forest, alert and waiting. The footsteps grew closer. Richard's confident heavy tread and the sharp staccato click of high heels on the marble floor. Victoria held her breath, a silent, desperate prayer on her lips that this was just a colleague, a business associate, a simple misunderstanding. But in the deepest part of her soul, she knew. The gilded cage was about to break open. Richard strode into the dining room with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the world arranged itself for his convenience. He was handsome, there was no denying it, with a head of thick, dark hair just starting to grey at the temples, and a smile that had for years been Victoria's undoing. Tonight that smile was stretched a little too wide, a little too bright. It didn't reach his eyes, which darted around the room, assessing the audience before him. "Sorry I'm late, everyone," he announced, his voice booming with false bonhomie. "Got held up. You know how it is." He gestured behind him. "I've brought a guest. I hope no one minds." Standing in the doorway, framed like a portrait, was the owner of the tinkling laugh. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with a cascade of fiery red hair that fell over the shoulders of a tight emerald green dress. The dress was expensive, but inappropriate for a quiet family dinner. It was cut too low at the front, and hugged a figure that was aggressively toned and sculpted. Her makeup was flawless, her lips a slash of bold crimson. She radiated a kind of ruthless, hungry energy that felt like a lit match in the staid, old-money atmosphere of the room. Victoria felt the air leave her lungs. This was not a colleague. This was not a business associate. This was the sharp foreign scent from his suits. This was the reason for the late nights and the silent blue-lit phone screens. "This is Scarlett Vance," Richard said, placing a proprietary hand on the small of her back. "Scarlett is one of our rising stars at the firm, an absolute genius with hostile takeovers. I've been mentoring her." Scarlett's eyes, a startling shade of jade green, swept over the table. She gave a small, practiced smile that didn't carry an ounce of warmth. Her gaze lingered for a moment on Catherine, and David dismissed Robert entirely and then settled on Victoria. It was a look of blatant appraisal, like a buyer inspecting property she intended to acquire. There was a flicker of triumph in those green depths, a predatory glint that made Victoria's skin crawl. "It's such an honor to finally meet you all," Scarlett said, her voice smooth and syrupy. "Richard talks about his family constantly." The lie was so bald-faced, so audacious, that it was almost impressive. Richard hadn't spoken more than 100 words to Victoria all week. Margaret gestured coolly to the empty space beside Richard. "Well, Miss Vance, since you are here, you may as well sit." "Anna," she called out, and a moment later, the housekeeper appeared, her face a stoic mask, as she took in the unexpected guest. "Please set another place." Anna nodded and disappeared into the kitchen, the very picture of discretion. Victoria watched the exchange, her mind a maelstrom of shock and humiliation. Richard had not only brought his mistress to their family home, but he had brought her to this dinner. To Margaret's dinner. It was a declaration of war, a flagrant act of disrespect, so profound she could hardly comprehend it. He was flaunting his betrayal in front of the very people whose opinions he supposedly valued most. Richard sat down, guiding Scarlett into the chair beside him, his hand lingering on her shoulder. He was acting as if this was the most normal thing in the world, as if he'd simply brought a friend home for a meal. He launched into a story about a deal they had just closed, with Scarlett, interjecting at strategic moments, laughing at his jokes, and touching his arm with a familiarity that was both casual and deeply intimate. They were a team, a unit. They moved and spoke with a shared rhythm that excluded everyone else at the table, most pointedly Victoria. Victoria felt 1,000 pairs of eyes on her, though she knew it was only 5. She could feel their pity, their shock, their discomfort. She looked down at her plate, at the perfectly arranged roasted quail she no longer had any appetite for. Her hands were trembling. She clasped them in her lap, digging her nails into her palms, willing herself not to shatter. She had to maintain her composure. For 15 years she had been the graceful, unflappable Mrs. Sterling. She would not give this girl, this Scarlett, the satisfaction of seeing her break. She forced herself to look up and meet Scarlett's gaze again. The younger woman was watching her over the rim of her wineglass, a small, knowing smirk playing on her lips. It was a direct challenge. "He's mine now. What are you going to do about it?" So Victoria Scarlett began her voice, dripping with faux sweetness, as she deliberately broke the conversation Richard was having with his father. "Richard tells me you do charity work that must be so fulfilling. Keeping yourself busy." The words were seemingly innocuous, but the condescension was as thick as mud. Keeping yourself busy, as if her life were a series of trivial hobbies designed to pass the time, while the important people did important work. Before Victoria could formulate a reply, Richard jumped in. "Tori is the chairman of the Children's Hospital Foundation Gala this year. It's a huge undertaking." He said it with a note of pride, but it felt like he was defending her a feeble attempt to grant her some legitimacy in the face of Scarlett's obvious contempt. Scarlett's smile widened. "Oh, of course. Planning parties. That's wonderful. I could never do it. I'm just not detail-oriented in that way. My focus is always on the bigger picture, the strategy, the win." She took a deliberate sip of her wine, her green eyes locked on Victoria's. "I guess we all have our different strengths." The insult was clear, a perfectly aimed dart. Victoria the party planner, Scarlett the strategist, the domestic versus the corporate, the past versus the future. Victoria felt a surge of cold fury cut through her shock. She lifted her chin, her voice steady and clear when she finally spoke. "You're right, Miss Vance. We do. One of my strengths is knowing the difference between a business meeting and a family dinner. It seems some people are still learning to make that distinction." A stunned silence fell over the table. David choked on a sip of water. Catherine's eyes were wide with alarm. Richard shot Victoria a furious, warning look. Scarlett's smile didn't falter, but a hard glint appeared in her eyes. The mask had slipped just for a second. "Oh, I think Richard and I know exactly what this is." She purred, placing her hand directly on top of Richard's on the table. "It's about being with the people who matter." Through it all, Margaret Sterling remained silent. She ate her quail with slow, deliberate movements, her expression placid. But Victoria, who had studied her mother-in-law for a decade and a half, saw it, a tightening of the muscles around her jaw, a stillness in her posture that was not relaxed but coiled. Margaret was listening. She was watching, and she was judging. The tension at the table was now a physical presence, thick and suffocating. David and Catherine made a valiant, if clumsy, attempt to steer the conversation back to safer waters, asking Richard about the stock market. But Scarlett was not to be deterred. She had come with a mission, and she was executing it with surgical precision. "Speaking of investments," Scarlett said, cutting David off mid-sentence, "Richard has been making some very bold moves lately. He's divesting from some of the older, more sentimental assets and reinvesting in things with more potential for aggressive growth. It's a brilliant strategy. Out with the old, in with the new." "Right, darling." She squeezed Richard's hand. He gave a tight, uncomfortable smile. "Scarlett has a very keen eye for value, Dad. You'd be impressed." Robert simply grunted, retreating further into the sanctuary of his wine glass. But Victoria understood the subtext perfectly. Older, sentimental assets. The words were aimed directly at her heart. She was the family's heritage china, beautiful, valuable, in a classical sense, but ultimately fragile and outdated, ready to be packed away to make room for something sleek and modern. Victoria set her fork down gently. She refused to be baited into a screaming match. She would not give them the drama they so clearly craved. She would meet this attack with the one thing she still owned, her dignity. "It sounds like you've been a great influence on him, Scarlett," Victoria said, her voice a dangerous calm. "Richard has always been so cautious. It's good to see him taking new risks." Scarlett's eyes narrowed. She had expected tears or a panicked retreat. This icy composure was not what she had planned for. She decided to abandon subtlety altogether. "Oh, I think cautious is the wrong word," Scarlett mused, leaning forward and resting her chin on her hand. Her emerald dress gaped slightly, a calculated display. "Maybe comfortable, complacent. It's easy to lose your edge when your life is too perfect, too predictable. A man like Richard needs a challenge. He needs to feel alive." "Don't you, Richard?" Richard shifted in his seat, finally looking cornered. The bravado he'd walked in with was beginning to fray. "Scarlett, maybe we should talk about this later." Why she challenged, her voice becoming louder, more theatrical. "Everyone here is family. Or almost everyone. I think it's important to be honest. All the cards on the table." She turned her full attention back to Victoria, her smile now a weapon. "For example, I think you should know that the Hong Kong merger Richard was working on last week, that was in a suite at the St. Regis, and the work was very, very hands-on." Catherine gasped. David stared at his plate, as if it held the secrets of the universe. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. The public declaration, the crude imagery, it was all designed for maximum humiliation. She felt dizzy, the chandelier's light fracturing into 1,000 painful shards. She looked at Richard, pleading with her eyes for him to stop this, to deny it, to say something, anything. He wouldn't meet her gaze. He just stared at the table, a muscle twitching in his jaw. His silence was her answer. It was the confirmation of every fear she had harbored for months, every sleepless night she'd spent wondering where he was. "And the new cologne you mentioned you didn't like," Victoria Scarlett continued relentless. "I bought that for him. I thought it smelled like success, like a man who isn't afraid to take what he wants. And what Richard wants is me." This was it. The final, brutal unveiling. Scarlett sat back in her chair, a triumphant queen who had just checkmated her opponent. She looked around the table, expecting to see a family in disarray, a wife broken, and a clear path to her prize. Victoria's vision swam, the faces around her blurred. She felt a profound, bottomless sense of betrayal. It wasn't just Richard. It was the 15 years she had poured into this family, this life. The birthdays she'd planned, the holidays she'd orchestrated, the fevers she'd nursed, the school projects she'd helped with. She had dedicated her entire adult life to the Sterling family, and in return she was being disposed of like a used-up commodity at their dinner table. She rose from her chair, her legs unsteady. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't sit there for one more second. She had to get away. "Victoria, sit down," Richard hissed, finally finding his voice. It was a command, not a plea. Her head snapped toward him, and in that moment the shock and pain crystallized into a diamond-hard rage. "Don't you dare," she whispered, her voice trembling with fury. "Don't you dare speak to me." She looked at Scarlett, at her smug, victorious face. "And you, Victoria," said her voice, gaining strength. "You think you've won. You think this performance makes you the victor. You are nothing but a cliché. A sad, pathetic girl, so desperate for a life you can't build yourself, that you have to steal someone else's. But you haven't stolen mine. You've just taken the trash out for me." Scarlett's face flushed with anger, her perfect composure finally cracking. "He's tired of you. He told me. He said you were a boring, predictable relic. He wants a real partner, not a museum piece." Enough. The word cut through the air like a whip. It wasn't Victoria's voice, or Richard's. It was Margaret's. Everyone turned to look at the head of the table. Margaret Sterling had placed her knife and fork neatly on her plate, parallel to each other. She dabbed her lips with her linen napkin, folded it, and placed it on the table. She had not raised her voice. She did not need to. The single word had carried more weight and authority than all the shouting that had preceded it. She surveyed the scene with her cold, assessing eyes. Her gaze swept over a stunned Scarlett, a furious Victoria, and finally it landed on her son, Richard. The look she gave him was not one of maternal disappointment or anger. It was something far colder, far more terrifying. It was a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. The room was utterly silent. The battle had been declared. The lines had been drawn. But everyone had misjudged who the true power player at the table was. They had all been waiting for the Queen's move, and she was finally ready to play her hand. The silence that followed Margaret's single sharp command was absolute. It was as if she had sucked all the air from the room, leaving everyone breathless and frozen in a tableau of domestic horror. Catherine looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole, while her husband, David, seemed to be actively trying to merge with his chair. Robert, for the first time all evening, looked directly at his wife, his expression a mixture of apprehension and morbid curiosity. Victoria stood by her chair, her body still thrumming with adrenaline and rage. She had been ready to flee, to run from the humiliation, but her mother-in-law's voice had anchored her to the spot. She found herself watching Margaret, a strange sense of foreboding, and a flicker of desperate hope mixing within her. Richard was the first to break the spell. He tried to reclaim control, to manage the situation as he would a hostile boardroom. "Mother, this is a private matter between Victoria and me." Margaret didn't even glance at him. Her steely gaze was fixed entirely on Scarlett. "Miss Vance," she began, her voice low and even utterly devoid of emotion. "You were a guest in my home, a guest brought here under false pretenses by my son, who seems to have forgotten the basic tenets of decency. You have abused my hospitality, insulted my daughter-in-law, and displayed a level of vulgarity I haven't witnessed since a dock workers' strike in 1978. Scarlett, who had momentarily been silenced, seemed to recover her bravado. She clearly mistook Margaret's calm demeanour for the weakness of an old woman clinging to outdated etiquette. "With all due respect, Mrs. Sterling," she said, tilting her chin up defiantly, "I'm not the one who's being vulgar. I'm being honest. Your son is in love with me. He wants a divorce. He was going to tell her, but he's too considerate. I decided to expedite the process. You decided." Margaret repeated the words, hanging in the air like icicles. "You, a person I have known for precisely 47 minutes, decided to expedite the dissolution of my son's 15-year marriage in my dining room. You believe you hold that kind of authority. I hold Richard's heart." "I think that's authority enough," Scarlett retorted, a smug smile returning to her face. She reached for Richard's hand again, but he pulled it away, his eyes darting nervously between his mother and his mistress. He was starting to realize this was not going according to plan. "Richard," Margaret said, finally turning her head to face her son. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, which was somehow more menacing than if she had screamed. "Is this true? Do you love this woman?" Richard swallowed hard. The entire table waited for his answer. This was his moment to either stand by his mistress or attempt to salvage his family. He chose a coward's path, the path of equivocation. "Mother, it's complicated. Victoria and we've been growing apart for years. Scarlett, she understands me. She understands my world. She understands your wallet." Victoria spat the words escaping before she could stop them. The betrayal was a fresh, gaping wound, and his pathetic justification was like salt being rubbed into it. "Stay out of this," Tory Richard snapped, his fear now curdling into anger, directed at the safest target. "No," Margaret said, her voice slicing through his. "She will not stay out of this. This is her home. This is her family. You, Richard, are the intruder here. You and this creature you dragged in with you." Scarlett's jaw dropped. The insult, so direct and dismissive, had clearly hit its mark. "Creature, how dare you?" Margaret ignored her completely, her focus still laser-sharp on her son. "I asked you a question, Richard. Do you love her? Do you intend to leave your wife for her?" Richard looked from Scarlett's expectant, furious face to his mother's impassive one. He was a man caught in a trap of his own making. "Yes." He finally mumbled the word, barely audible. "Yes, I do." A pained sob escaped Catherine's lips. Victoria felt the finality of that word like a physical blow. It was one thing to know another, to hear it spoken aloud in this room surrounded by family. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She looked at her husband, the man she had loved since she was 22, the father of her children, and she saw a complete stranger. A weak, cruel man who had not only cheated on her but had orchestrated her public humiliation. "Then you are a bigger fool than I ever thought possible," Margaret said, her voice ringing with clarity. She didn't look sad or angry. She looked disappointed, as if she were examining a product that had been revealed to have a fatal, irredeemable flaw. She then did something no one expected. She turned to Victoria, her expression softened almost imperceptibly, a subtle thawing of the icy mask. "Victoria," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I believe Miss Vance has made it quite clear that she feels you are an older sentimental asset, a museum piece. She believes you are being replaced." Victoria could only nod, tears finally welling in her eyes, blurring the faces of her tormentors. "She is mistaken," Margaret stated, turning her formidable gaze back to the rest of the table. "She is operating under the misapprehension that my son holds the power in this family. She believes that by securing him, she has secured a prize." Margaret paused, letting her words sink in. A slow, chilling smile touched her lips. It was a terrifying sight. "It is time," she said, her voice resonating with newfound power, "for a lesson in family finance." A profound and confused silence settled over the dining room. Margaret's words, "a lesson in family finance," were so unexpected, so completely out of left field, that everyone was momentarily stunned into stillness. Scarlett looked bewildered, her triumphant expression replaced by one of wary confusion. Richard seemed equally lost, a frown creasing his forehead as he tried to understand his mother's strange tangent. He opened his mouth to speak, but Margaret raised a single imperious hand and he fell silent. For 35 years, Margaret began her voice, the calm, measured tone of a professor beginning a lecture. "My husband, Robert, and I have managed the Sterling family assets. Or rather, I have managed them. Robert, bless his heart, has always been more interested in his orchids." Robert gave a slight affirming nod, as if this were a well-established fact. "The company that you run." "Richard," she continued, pinning her son with her gaze, "Sterling Innovations. You believe you built it. You tell your friends at the golf club that you started it from the ground up, with your own grit and brilliance. This is the narrative you have constructed for yourself, and it is a fiction." Richard's face began to redden. "Mother, what are you talking about? I secured the venture capital, I put in the work." "You secured nothing," Margaret cut in, her voice sharp as glass. "The initial seed money, all $5 million of it, did not come from a venture capital firm. It came from a trust I control, a trust that was established by my father, not yours. The subsequent rounds of funding, the lines of credit, the guarantees that kept you afloat during the dot-com bust and the 2008 recession, all of it was underwritten by me, using assets from that same trust. You were never a brilliant entrepreneur, Richard. You were a subsidized hobby." The color drained from Richard's face. He looked utterly shell-shocked, as if his mother had just announced that the sky was green. "That's not true." "Dad," he appealed, turning to his father. Robert cleared his throat. "Your mother is a very shrewd financial manager, son. It was always her purview." Margaret gave a dry, humorless smile. "Indeed. And my purview extends to the terms of your employment. You are the CEO of Sterling Innovations, yes. But you are not the owner. You are an employee with a very generous salary and stock options that are, I might add, entirely conditional. The majority shareholder, the one with the controlling interest, is the Sterling Family Trust, and I am the sole trustee." Scarlett was now staring at Margaret with wide, horrified eyes. The confident, predatory glint was gone, replaced by the dawning, sickening realization that she had targeted the wrong prey. She had hitched her wagon to a prince, only to discover he was merely the court jester. Furthermore, Margaret went on her delivery relentless. "This house, the one you so brazenly brought this woman into, it is not your house. It does not belong to you and Victoria. It belongs to the trust. The cars you drive, the club memberships, the ludicrously expensive watches you are so fond of, all of it is paid for by the trust. You, Richard, personally own very little. A few bad stock picks and a truly appalling collection of designer sneakers. She paused, taking a deliberate sip of water. She was enjoying this. Every calculated, devastating word. This was her courtroom, and she was both judge and executioner. "Now let's talk about Victoria," she said, turning her body slightly to face her daughter-in-law. Victoria, who had been listening in a state of numb disbelief, looked up. "When you married Victoria, Richard, you were a 30-year-old man with a middling job and a mountain of potential you seemed determined to squander. Victoria came from a good family, a wealthy family." "Do you remember the prenuptial agreement we all signed?" Richard nodded numbly. "Of course." "I'm sure you do," Margaret said with a hint of acid. "You were so keen to protect your future sterling earnings from her. But your memory seems to have failed you on the finer points. The agreement stipulated that in the event of a divorce due to your infidelity, a clause her father, a very wise man, insisted upon all assets acquired during the marriage would be split 70-30, in her favor. But more importantly, it included a buy-in clause. Her father invested $2 million into what was then a fledgling Sterling Innovations. That money was not a gift to you. It was an investment in her name in exchange for a 10% equity stake. A stake that has grown rather significantly over the past 15 years thanks to my management, and despite your best efforts to run the company into the ground with your bold moves." Margaret turned her cool gaze back to Scarlett. "You see, Miss Vance, you made a critical error in your strategic analysis. You identified Victoria as a liability to be discarded, a sentimental asset. But the truth is, Victoria is a significant shareholder. You, on the other hand, are what we in the business world call a bad debt, an expense with no return on investment." She folded her hands on the table. The lecture was over. It was time for the verdict. "So here is what will happen," she declared, her voice resonating with absolute finality. "Richard, you will pack a bag with your sneakers and whatever else you personally own. You will leave this house tonight. You are fired as CEO of Sterling Innovations, effective immediately. Your shares are forfeit, as per the morals clause in your employment contract, which you clearly never bothered to read. The company credit cards will be cancelled by the time you reach the end of the driveway. Mother, you can't." Richard gasped, panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "I can," Margaret said simply. "And I have. Now for you, Miss Vance." She looked at Scarlett, as if she were a piece of lint to be flicked away. "Your services at the company are also no longer required. I believe your mentorship with Richard constitutes a breach of your contract as well. You have 10 minutes to get off my property before I have you removed for trespassing." She then looked at Victoria, whose tears had stopped, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. "Victoria, my dear, I apologize for my son's deplorable behavior. This house is your home for as long as you wish it to be. Tomorrow, we will have lunch with my attorneys, and we will begin the process of ensuring you receive every single thing you are entitled to, which I assure you is a great deal." The fallout from Margaret's decree was instantaneous and chaotic. Richard leapt to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "This is insane. You can't just fire me. It's my company, my life. It was never your company, Richard." Margaret replied, her voice unmoved. She was no longer looking at him, already dismissing him from her reality. "It was a loan, and your credit has expired." Scarlett, seeing her entire future evaporate before her eyes, turned on Richard with the ferocity of a cornered animal. "You told me you owned everything. You lied to me." She shrieked, her carefully constructed glamour melting away to reveal a raw, grasping panic. You said we would travel, that I'd never have to work again. You useless, pathetic liar. Shut up, Scarlet, Richard yelled back, rounding on her. This is your fault, pushing me, forcing this tonight. You've ruined everything. Their bitter, panicked recriminations filled the elegant dining room, a vulgar stain on its pristine atmosphere. Catherine and David seemed frozen in horror, while Robert simply closed his eyes, as if wishing himself away to his quiet greenhouse. Victoria watched them, and a strange clarity washed over her. The pain of the betrayal was still there, a deep, aching wound in her chest. But seeing Richard not as the powerful, charismatic man she had married, but as a petulant, spoiled boy being scolded by his mother, broke the spell he'd held over her for 15 years. The man she had loved, or the idea of him she had loved, was gone. In his place was this weak, flailing stranger. Margaret let them squabble for another moment, before she spoke again, her voice cutting through their frantic noise. Security will be here in 5 minutes to escort you both out. I suggest you use the time to collect yourselves. She picked up her wine glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, the very picture of unbothered authority. The threat of security was real. Richard knew it. His shoulders slumped in defeat. All the fight went out of him, replaced by a hollow, vacant look. He had been utterly and completely checkmated. Without a word, he turned and strode out of the dining room. A moment later, they heard his heavy footsteps ascending the grand staircase. Scarlet stood alone, looking utterly lost. Her emerald dress now seemed cheap, her bold makeup garish. She looked at Margaret, then at Victoria, a desperate, pleading look in her eyes. There was no mercy to be found. With a choked sob, she grabbed her designer handbag from the floor and fled from the room, the sharp click of her heels on the marble echoing her humiliating retreat. The dining room was quiet once more. The storm had passed, leaving devastation in its wake. Anna the housekeeper appeared as if summoned by the silence, and began to clear the plates with silent efficiency, her face betraying nothing. Catherine and David, after a few murmured awkward words of support for Victoria, made a hasty exit. Robert gave his wife a long, unreadable look before rising and saying, "I'll be in the study." Finally, Victoria and Margaret were alone at the long mahogany table, the remnants of the disastrous meal between them. The air was thick with unspoken words. Victoria found her voice, though it was raspy and weak. I had no idea, Margaret, about the trust, the finances." Margaret looked at her, and for the first time in 15 years, Victoria saw something in her mother-in-law's eyes beyond cool appraisal. It was a flicker of empathy, perhaps even respect. "Of course you didn't," Margaret said. "Richard didn't either. It was an arrangement I made with your father before the wedding. We both saw Richard's potential for recklessness. Your father wanted to ensure your future was protected, and I wanted to ensure my family's legacy wasn't squandered by a fool. Our interests were aligned." She reached across the table, and in a gesture that shocked Victoria more than anything else that had happened all night, she placed her cool, dry hand over Victoria's. "I am not a sentimental woman, Victoria. You know this. But I value loyalty. I value integrity. For 15 years you have been a loyal and gracious wife and mother. You have upheld the dignity of this family, even when my son was doing his best to drag it through the mud. You are a sterling in character, if not by birth." That girl, she said with a gesture of disgust toward the empty doorway, was an opportunistic parasite. "And Richard is a disappointment, my greatest disappointment." A tear slipped down Victoria's cheek, not of sadness, but of a strange, overwhelming relief. She was not being discarded. She was not being replaced. She had been seen. Her years of quiet dedication, which she thought had gone unnoticed, had been observed and valued by the one person whose opinion truly mattered. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Victoria asked, her voice a whisper. "Because it was never necessary," Margaret replied simply. "The trust was a safety net, an emergency measure. I had hoped my son would mature, that he would grow into the man I raised him to be. I held out that hope for a very long time." Tonight she sighed a faint, weary sound. "He finally proved me wrong. He forced my hand." The heavy front door slammed shut, the sound final and absolute. The footsteps of Richard and Scarlett could be heard crunching on the gravel driveway as they walked away from the house, from the family, from the life they had tried to claim. Margaret squeezed Victoria's hand gently. "He is gone. They are gone. Now we rebuild." In the quiet, cavernous dining room, surrounded by the ghosts of a broken marriage, Victoria felt not an ending, but a new and terrifying beginning. And for the first time, she was not facing it alone. She was facing it with the most powerful ally she could have ever imagined. In the days that followed the cataclysmic dinner, a new order began to establish itself within the walls of the Stirling mansion. The house, which had once felt like a beautiful but empty museum, now felt like a headquarters. A quiet, purposeful energy replaced the stale tension that had lingered for months. The first week was the strangest. The silence Richard left behind was cavernous, echoing in the hallways he used to stride down in the empty space, in the garage, where his Porsche had been, in the hollow indentation his body had left on his side of the bed. On the third day, Victoria decided she couldn't sleep in that room another night. With a resolve that felt foreign and exhilarating, she moved her things into one of the grand guest suites overlooking the gardens. That afternoon, she went into Richard's enormous walk-in closet, the one he had been so proud of, and began to pack. She did it herself, refusing the housekeeper's offer of help. It was a ritual she needed to perform alone. She methodically took down the rows of expensive soulless suits, the garish designer sneakers Margaret had so accurately despised, the silk ties Scarlett had probably helped him pick out. At the back of a drawer beneath a stack of old university sweaters, she found a small worn leather box. Inside was a collection of photos from their early years, a goofy picture of them on a ski lift in Vermont, another of them on the steps of their first tiny apartment, young and full of a hope she had long since forgotten. For a moment, a wave of profound sorrow washed over her, not for the man who had just been ejected from her life, but for the boy in the photographs, the one who had disappeared so long ago. She looked at the image, at the genuine, unforced smile on her own face, and felt a pang for that lost girl. Then, with a deep breath, she closed the box, placed it inside a larger one with the rest of his belongings, and sealed the lid. It was not an act of anger, but of closure. She was packing away a ghost. Her days found a new rhythm, centered around the mahogany desk in the family study. Every morning at 10 she would meet Margaret for what they began to call their briefings. Margaret was a surprisingly patient, if exacting, teacher. She laid out the architecture of the Stirling Trust with the precision of a master architect explaining a blueprint. She taught Victoria how to read a balance sheet, not just for its numbers, but for the story it told about a company's health and integrity. Anyone can see profit and loss, Margaret explained one morning, tapping a long, elegant finger on a quarterly report. That's simple arithmetic. The real skill is reading the spaces between the numbers. Look here at the charitable donations line item for this tech firm. It's a flat, predictable percentage. It's for tax purposes a PR move. Now look at this one, she said, sliding another folder over. The donations fluctuate. They target specific community needs. It's messier, less predictable. It tells you that the leadership is engaged not just writing a check. One is an investment in image, the other is an investment in community. We invest in the latter. Victoria found herself absorbed or fascinated. Her mind, so long occupied with social calendars and household management, felt like it was stretching, waking up. She began to ask questions, to challenge assumptions, to see the patterns Margaret spoke of. A phone call from her sister-in-law, Catherine, one afternoon, further cemented her new reality. "Tori, I had to call." Catherine began, her voice full of a hesitant warmth. "I'm so horribly, deeply sorry for what Richard did, for what we all sat and watched him do. He's a stranger to me now." "It's not your fault, Catherine," Victoria said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "But it's how you handled it. And Mother, my God, I've never seen her like that. David and I were talking and we are in awe of you both. Whatever you need, Tori. Anything. We're on your side, unconditionally." The simple, heartfelt declaration of allegiance meant more to Victoria than Catherine could ever know. The old family structure which had revolved around Richard as the sun had collapsed. A new one was being built in its place, forged not of obligation, but of loyalty and mutual respect among its women. Whispers of Richard's and Scarlett's fate trickled back, as they inevitably did in their small, gossipy circle. Catherine mentioned hearing from a friend that Scarlett had been seen having a tearful, frantic lunch with a headhunter, her rising star status apparently non-transferable, without the sterling name backing it. David had heard on the financial grapevine that Richard had approached several old contacts for backing on a new venture, only to be politely but firmly turned away. No one wanted to be associated with a man who had not only been publicly disowned by the formidable Margaret Sterling, but had also proven himself to be a financial fraud, a prince with no kingdom. Their spectacular downfall was a quiet, satisfying counterpoint to Victoria's steady ascent. 2 months after that fateful dinner, the November air was crisp, and the last of the autumn leaves clung to the trees. Margaret summoned Victoria to the study. The room, once imposing and foreign, now felt like her own. "The divorce is final," Margaret said, her tone business-like, but her eyes held a softer light. She pushed a thick document across the desk. Richard signed everything. He had little choice. "This is the settlement. It is as stipulated, exceedingly generous to you." Victoria looked at the papers, at the staggering numbers that represented her new, independent financial reality. It felt abstract, but solid. It was security. It was freedom. "Thank you, Margaret," she said softly. "You have nothing to thank me for." "This is what you earned," Margaret corrected her gently. She slid a second, slimmer folder across the desk. "This, however, is more important. It's a proposal. I am officially petitioning the board to amend the structure of the Sterling Family Trust. I am stepping down as the sole trustee." She paused, letting the weight of her words fill the room. "I am appointing 2 new co-trustees." She tapped 2 signature lines at the bottom of the front page. One was already signed in her elegant, sharp script. The other was blank with Victoria's full name typed beneath it. Victoria stared at it, her heart hammering. "Me but, Margaret, I don't know enough. I'm just learning. I've spent 15 years planning menus, not mergers. And in doing so, you learned how to manage budgets, how to negotiate with vendors, how to lead teams of volunteers, and how to present a flawless public face under immense pressure," Margaret countered smoothly. "Do not ever mistake the skills of a domestic manager for being lesser. They are simply applied in a different arena. I can teach you finance, I cannot teach character. She stood and walked to the large bay window, her posture as straight and unyielding as ever. I have watched you for 2 months, Victoria. You have a cautious and discerning mind, where Richard had a reckless and arrogant one. You have empathy, which makes you a better judge of a person's worth than a resume ever could. And you are loyal. In this world, that is the most valuable and rarest asset of all. Victoria joined her at the window, her mind reeling. She looked from the imposing figure of her mother-in-law to her own reflection in the glass. She no longer saw the frightened, humiliated woman from that dinner. She saw a woman who had survived an inferno and was just beginning to realize she was fireproof. "I am 72 years old," Margaret said, her voice softer now. "My legacy can't be Richard's failure. It needs to be our success. This family needs a future. It needs a leader with integrity. You are that person, Victoria. You have proven it." She turned to face her fully. "So I am not asking you to be my replacement. I am asking you to be my partner." Victoria looked down at the document on the desk, then back at Margaret's waiting expression. The fear was still there, a faint tremor in the background, but it was overshadowed by a powerful, surging sense of purpose. She could never go back to being the woman who arranged flowers and smoothed over her husband's indiscretions. That woman was gone, packed away in a box with old photographs. "Okay," Victoria said, her voice quiet but firm. She walked back to the desk, picked up the heavy ink-filled pen, and signed her name on the line. Her signature was not the looping, graceful script of the society wife she had been. It was stronger, bolder, the signature of a woman claiming her power. "When do we start?" A genuine, brilliant smile lit up Margaret's face. "We already have. And so the house on Sycamore Hill, once a symbol of a broken marriage, became the headquarters of an empire run by 2 formidable women. Victoria no longer a wife in the shadows, and Margaret the matriarch who rewrote the rules, proved that true family isn't about blood ties, but about the unwavering loyalty and strength you find in the most unexpected alliances. They didn't just survive the betrayal. They built a new legacy from its ashes, one founded on integrity, intelligence, and the quiet, unshakable power of women who had been underestimated for far too long. What did you think of Margaret's incredible reaction? Who was the real villain in this story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice and empowerment, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more unforgettable, real-life dramas. Your support means the world.